Caithness has its fair share of wild weather, but an unusual summer storm brought devastation to the county in the mid-19th century. At the time, Wick Harbour was a hive of activity during the herring season. The catch was landed and the fish gutted by the herring girls before being placed in barrels with salt, ready to be transported to markets. Friday, 18th August 1848 began like any other, as the boats prepared to set sail. They left the harbour in the afternoon in fine weather and headed south. Many headed off to their chosen fishing grounds, while others anchored out in the bay, waiting until dusk, as there was good fishing to be had inshore. The fishermen cast their nets and waited as a gentle breeze blew in from the southwest. Around 8 p.m, the sky suddenly turned red in the west, and clouds thickened and darkened in the east, while the barometer began to plummet. The ominous signs of a storm saw some of the fishermen raise their nets and head back to their respective ports. Fortunately, they tied up before the storm began in earnest. By midnight, the wind had died down a little, and the boats that had continued fishing began pulling in their nets, ready to head for Wick. An hour later, the wind violently picked up again, causing the sea to swell and the boats to roll, pitch and yaw. They came within sight of the harbour, but being in complete darkness, it was difficult to navigate the rocks at the entrance of the North Quay. As dawn broke, hundreds of boats all along the east coast battled against the storm. People gathered at piers, beaches and on cliff tops, looking on helplessly as their loved ones were tossed about on the stormy swell, while they waited for high tide. At Wick, the bar at the entrance to the harbour had become almost impassable from the waves crashing over it. Nonetheless, with the boats having nowhere to go, they began attempting to get to safety. Some fishermen mistook Wick Bay for Rees Bay, as there was no light on the Pulteney Town South Quay head, and they didn't realise their mistake until they found themselves among the breakwaters in the area of the Pulteney Town harbour. One by one, the boats tried to get to safety, but many collided with each other as they attempted the dangerous passage in the gale-forced wind into the harbour. A couple of boats were completely swamped by one entire sheet of wave, and all the crewmen lost their lives, while another crashed onto Proudfoot Rocks on the north side of the bay, where it broke apart, killing 2 fishermen just after 4 o'clock. It appeared they'd been running to land when their rudder gave way. Taking to the oars, they mistook their position and had believed they were further south than they were. Their bodies were found at the boat, with one of the men having several cuts to his body. Another boat belonging to William Doole of Wick smashed into the end of the South Quay. As soon as it hit, the crew got up the back of the South Quay, with the exception of Doole, who wanted to save his son. They both drowned, but the rest of the crew survived. A boat belonging to Robert Weir of Wick was run down by the South Shields schooner, the Anne and Elizabeth, while on their nets, but those in the schooner paid no attention to the men in trouble. Eventually they ran their boat to Noss Head, and when it hit, they jumped onto the rocks. Their actions saved their lives, although their boat was lost. On another boat, 2 fishermen were rescued before it was overwhelmed by the surge. The rest of its crew were lost. A fisherman clinging to the mast of his vessel for half an hour was also rescued, The mast had floated towards the shore and ropes were thrown out to him, but he'd been clinging on so long, his hands couldn't grab the rope. George Sinclair, a boat carpenter, and William Young, a mason, took matters into their own hands. They tied the ropes round their waists and swung themselves out over the quay into the breakers, pulling the man to safety. John Sutherland, the emigration agent, was almost the only man on the parapet wall and quickly descended the ladder attached to the back of the quay. Hanging onto the ladder with one hand, he stretched out his other and managed to save the lives of 2 fishermen. However, the rest of that crew were driven off by the surge and perished. Debris from the boats floated as far as the eye could see, with Broadhaven seeing the worst, with 5 or 6 boats running into one another, being completely destroyed. In the smaller ports along the coast, boats crashed onto rocks or were swamped by the huge waves and wrecked. Even boats tied up in sheltered harbours were severely damaged. In all, the far north lost 37 men that day and 18 boats were destroyed. 17 men were married and 60 children were now left fatherless. Some of the bodies were recovered when the storm abated, while others were only found weeks later. Those who died were William Doole and his son, David Geddes and his crew from Staxigo. All of those on board rose from Slickley. The crew of the Harmony of Pulteney Town, Murdoch Morrison and his crew from Lewis, George Swanson of the Peggy from Thurso, James Mason and his crew from Longhope-on-Orkney, Murdoch MacDonald and his crew from Lewis, Donald Morrison and some of his crew also from Lewis, and all on board Hope of Pulteney Town. John Bain of Castleton had got wet the previous evening, so had left his boat and came ashore, promising to return to another boat. He joined the crew of the Harmony, having missed his own boat, with that crew deciding to return to the harbour just as the storm began, and they reached safety. Bain went down with the Harmony. It was a night that claimed around 100 lives along the east coast, from Johnshaven to Fraserburgh, Helmsdale and Wick, with the loss of 124 boats. There was some relief, however. A Belgian boat rode out the gale. She'd arrived in Wick Bay, but found herself too much to the leeward side, so threw out 2 anchors. Many thought the anchors wouldn't hold, but they did, and the crew arrived safely in Pulteney Town Harbour at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, followed by another 2 fishing boats. Early on the Sunday morning, Donald Angus's boat arrived, having managed to ride out the gale. By the Monday, only 1 boat remained unaccounted for, the boat belonging to Ralph Sutherland of Walls in Shetland. However, on the Tuesday, it turned up at Orkney. An inquiry into the disaster took place, and Captain John Washington's report on the loss of life and damage caused to fishing boats on the east coast of Scotland in the gale of 19 August 1848 was presented to Parliament in 1849. One reason it cites for the massive loss was the way the boats were built. Each boat had a 30-foot keel and was open, apart from a little wooden shelter, allowing them to be easily swamped in high seas, unlike their covered English counterparts. The report also led to improvements in harbour design and construction. It concluded that if the fishermen had remained at sea, they may have ridden out the storm. For many years, No fishermen took their boats out on the anniversary of the disaster, fearing it was a bad omen. Wick's Black Saturday, as it became known, was immortalised in a painting by Robert Anderson in 1885. The men who lost their lives are as follows. The Lewis men were Murdoch Morrison, George Finlayson, Kenneth Murray, Colin Finlayson, Donald MacLeod, Murdoch MacDonald, John McCaskill, William McCaskill, John MacLeod, Donald MacDonald, John Smith, John McGurney, and Alexander Mackenzie. The Caithness men were William Doole, James Doole, David Geddes, Andrew Geddes, Thomas Manson, John Campbell, James Lyle, Robert Campbell, George Swanson, William Bremner, John Houston, John Campbell, John Bain, Alex Reid, and John Manson. The Sutherland men were Hector Mackay, Robert Mackay, and Donald Morrison. The Orkney men who lost their lives were James Manson, Donald Sutherland, George Sutherland, William Bakey, Robert Linklater, and George Meadows. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.